On September 4th, 1981, in Houston, Texas, a baby was born into a household that looked ordinary on paper. Hardworking parents, a steady life, and no guarantee of fame. Her mother, Tina Knowles, built her days around hair, beauty, and business. Her father, Matthew Knowles, worked in corporate America, where success was measured in numbers, quotas, and discipline. But what no one could have predicted, what no one could have truly understood, was that this child would grow into a force so powerful that her name alone would become a brand, a symbol, and a cultural event. Because Beyonce didn't just become famous, she became unavoidable. But here's what most people miss. Beyonce's story wasn't written by luck. It wasn't handed to her by the industry. And it definitely was overnight. Behind the perfection, behind the lights, behind the flawless performances that look effortless on stage, there is a story filled with pressure, rejection, sacrifice, and moments where everything could have collapsed. This documentary is not just the celebration. It's the climb. Before the world crowned her queen, she was a child learning how quickly applause can turn into judgment. She was a girl trying to prove herself in rooms where people smiled politely while preparing to say no. She was a young performer carrying expectations heavier than her age, because talent is one thing but belief is another. And Beyoncé didn't just want to sing. She wanted to become something. She wanted to move audiences, control stages, and create a legacy that couldn't be erased. And that hunger, that intensity, didn't come from nowhere. It was built. It was trained. It was sharpened through years of competition, practice, and the kind of discipline that most people only talk about but never actually live. While other kids played, she rehearsed. While others rested, she repeated choreography until her body stopped questioning it. She didn't just learn music, she learned command. But no matter how gifted she was, the world didn't instantly open its doors. In fact, one of the earliest defining moments in her journey was not a win. It was a loss. A televised failure that could have ended everything before it started. A moment that exposed a brutal truth. Talent is not always rewarded immediately. Sometimes it's tested. Sometimes it's dismissed. Sometimes you're forced to decide whether you want the dream badly enough to survive embarrassment. And she did. That moment didn't break her. It trained her. It taught her that being great isn't about never falling. It's about how you respond when you do. Then came the group. A handful of young girls shaped into a unit, pushed into auditions, trained to blend, trained to match, trained to perform as one. It was the birth of what would become Destiny's Child, one of the most successful girl groups in history. But even that part of the story, the part most people remember as glamorous, was filled with chaos beneath the surface. Lineup changes, betrayal rumors, pressure from management, public scrutiny, and a level of criticism that would crush most people before they ever reached adulthood. And at the center of all of it was Beyoncé, still growing, still becoming, still learning what it means to be both celebrated and blamed. Because fame is not gentle. Fame does not ask if you are ready. And Beyoncé learned early that when people can't control you, they try to define you. They label you. They reduce you. They build narratives around you that have nothing to do with who you truly are, and then they expect you to live inside those narratives forever. But Beyoncé was never built to stay inside anyone else's story. That's why her career is not just a timeline of albums and awards. It's a timeline of reinvention. Every era is a decision. Every move is calculated. Every project is a statement, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always intentional. She didn't just release music, she released moments. And those moments came with consequences. Because behind the curtain, Beyoncé faced battles the public only sees in pieces. Depression that she struggled to admit out loud, private grief that she carried while the world demanded smiles, a marriage that became a global discussion, and a level of pressure that turned her life into something millions felt entitled to analyze. Yet even in the middle of that, she created. She built. She evolved. She turned pain into art, and art into impact. And that's where the story becomes bigger than fame. Because Beyoncé didn't just dominate charts, she shaped culture. She changed how albums could be released. She changed what performances could look like. She forced the world to pay attention to visuals, to narratives, to symbolism. She didn't follow the industry's rules, she made the industry chase her. And the deeper you go into her story, the clearer it becomes. The most powerful version of Beyonce is not the one you see on stage. It's the one you don't see. The one planning, producing, directing, building an empire behind closed doors while the world assumes it's all effortless. That's the mystery behind her. How does someone become that precise? That controlled? That consistently excellent? How does someone survive decades of scrutiny and still evolve, still surprise people, still set standards no one can match? And here's the most important question of all. What does it cost? Because for every legendary performance, there's exhaustion. For every flawless era, there's a sacrifice. For every iconic moment, there's a chapter the public never fully understands. So in this documentary, we're going to trace the full arc, from the Houston childhood where it all began, to the competitions, to Destiny's Child, to the solo explosion that changed pop music forever. We're going to follow the moments that defined her career, the controversies that tested her, the personal battles that reshaped her, and the projects that cemented her as one of the most influential artists of our time. This is not just the story of a singer. This is the story of how Beyoncé became Beyoncé. And by the time we reach the end, you won't just understand what she achieved. You'll understand what she survived to achieve it. Before the world learned to chant her name, before the title of Queen ever followed her footsteps, before the stages grew larger than cities, Beyoncé was simply a child growing up in Houston, Texas, surrounded not by fame, but by structure. Her birth did not come with prophecy. There were no industry insiders waiting outside hospital doors. No contracts, no guarantees. What she entered instead was a household defined by work ethic, routine, and expectation. Her mother, Tina Knowles, ran a hair salon that doubled as a creative space, where beauty was not just aesthetic, but expression. Her father, Matthew Knowles, operated in the corporate world, where results mattered more than excuses and discipline was non-negotiable. That balance, art on one side, structure on the other, would quietly shape everything Beyoncé became. From an early age, it was clear she was different. Not louder, not flashier, different in focus. Where other children drifted, she concentrated. Where others played, she practiced. Singing was not a hobby, it was instinct. And when she sang, it wasn't tentative. It was precise, controlled, intentional. Adults noticed not just her voice, but her seriousness. Talent gets attention. Discipline earns investment. Houston at the time was not a shortcut to stardom. It was competitive, local, unforgiving. Talent shows were not gentle encouragements, they were public tests. And at just 7 years old, Beyoncé entered one of them, standing on stage against performers nearly twice her age. When she sang, the room changed. Not because she was perfect, but because she was fearless. She won. But winning didn't soften her environment. It sharpened it. Instead of being praised and protected, she was pushed further. Dance classes, vocal lessons, rehearsals stacked on top of schoolwork. Her schedule began to resemble that of a professional long before she understood what professionalism truly meant. Childhood was not removed, but it was restructured. And this is where the myth begins to crack. Because Beyoncé was not raised on comfort, she was raised on repetition. Mistakes were not dramatized, they were corrected. Success was not celebrated, it was expected. When something wasn't good enough, it was redone. When it was good, it was refined. The lesson was simple and relentless. Talent is useless without control. This approach created something rare, someone who did not fear critique. But it also created pressure. As Beyoncé grew older, her world narrowed. While other children explored freely, she committed. Social life took a back seat to rehearsal. Leisure bowed to preparation. This wasn't forced cruelty, it was intentional molding. Her parents believed that excellence was not accidental, and they treated her accordingly. Then came the moment that changed everything. An audition. At just 8 years old, Beyoncé met other girls who shared her ambition. They didn't come together as friends, they came together as competitors. That distinction mattered. The group that would eventually become Destiny's Child did not begin with harmony, it began with tension. Because when ambition meets ambition, nothing is guaranteed. They trained, they traveled, they performed. They were entered into competitions across Houston, chasing validation that rarely came easily. And then, on national television, they faced a defining loss. They failed. Publicly. On a stage designed to crown winners, they were eliminated. The performance fell flat. The feedback was blunt. And for most children, that moment would have ended the dream. For Beyonce, it became fuel. Years later, she would admit that the song choice was wrong, the preparation incomplete, the execution flawed. But in that moment, what mattered wasn't the technical failure, it was the emotional response. She didn't retreat. She studied. She learned that effort alone was not enough. Strategy mattered. Presentation mattered. Control mattered. That lesson would echo throughout her entire career. Following that loss, the family made a decision that would permanently alter their lives. Matthew Knowles left his stable corporate job to manage the group full-time. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Income was cut in half. Comfort disappeared. Stability fractured. The family split households. This was not a glamorous sacrifice. It was risk in its rawest form, betting everything on a future that did not yet exist. And that risk placed enormous pressure on a child who was still learning who she was. Beyonce felt that weight. She trained harder. She performed sharper. She internalized responsibility long before she should have had to. Because when adults gamble, children often carry the consequences. But what emerged from that environment was something unshakable. Professionalism. By the time Destiny's Child was formally taking shape, Beyonce was no longer just a member, she was the axis. Not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. She remembered choreography faster. She corrected mistakes silently. She held standards when others wavered. And that distinction came with isolation. Leadership is lonely, especially when you're young. As lineup changes began, as tensions grew, and as external criticism mounted, Beyonce learned a harsh truth early. When things go wrong, the most visible person is blamed. When things go right, the system is praised. That dynamic would follow her forever. By the end of this chapter of her life, Beyonce was no longer just a gifted child. She was conditioned, focused, controlled, resilient. She had already experienced failure, pressure, sacrifice, and public judgment before the world ever called her a star. And that is why what came next mattered. Because when Destiny's Child finally broke through, it wasn't luck reaching a prepared artist. It was preparation colliding with opportunity. And Beyonce was ready. Success rarely arrives cleanly. For Beyonce, it arrived loud, fast, and fractured. When Destiny's Child finally broke through, the timing felt sudden to the outside world. But inside the group, it felt overdue. Years of rejection, unstable contracts, lineup changes, and financial strain had hardened them long before the spotlight arrived. Their ascent wasn't a miracle, it was an ignition. The industry took notice when Destiny's Child stopped sounding like hopefuls and started sounding inevitable. Radio embraced them. Music videos circulated, performances sharpened, and at the center of it all stood Beyonce, not because she demanded attention, but because attention naturally bent toward her. Her voice anchored the group. Her presence defined the stage. Her precision turned performances into statements. But visibility comes with consequences. As Destiny's Child climbed charts and entered mainstream consciousness, the group dynamic began to shift. Not in obvious ways, at first. On stage, everything looked unified. Off stage, pressure exposed fault lines that had been quietly forming for years. Management decisions became public discussion. Creative control became a silent tension. Roles within the group hardened, and perception began to drift away from reality. Beyonce was increasingly framed as the leader, even when leadership wasn't officially claimed. And in pop culture, perception becomes truth faster than facts. The group's massive success with the writing on the Wall era cemented their place in music history. Singles dominated airwaves. Awards followed. Destiny's Child was no longer rising, they had arrived. But arrival magnifies everything. As the group's profile expanded, disagreements that once stayed private spilled into public view. Lineup changes, already a sensitive subject, became headlines. Accusations followed. Narratives formed quickly and without nuance. And Beyonce, as the most visible member, absorbed the impact. She became the symbol people pointed to, rightly or wrongly. Blame followed her shadow. Criticism questioned her motives. And suddenly, a teenager who had spent most of her life rehearsing was navigating adult scrutiny under unforgiving lights. The pressure wasn't just professional, it was personal. Behind the scenes, Beyonce experienced something she had never truly faced before: isolation. Success separated her from peers who couldn't relate. Criticism distanced her from collaborators who questioned her intentions. And expectations trapped her in a role she hadn't chosen, but couldn't escape. Then came the breaking point. Public conflict fractured the group's image. Lawsuits, departures, media speculation. The narrative shifted from music to drama almost overnight. Destiny's Child, once praised for unity, was now dissected for dysfunction. And for Beyoncé, the toll was severe. She later described this period as one of the darkest in her life. Depression crept in quietly, then settled heavily. Motivation faltered. Confidence wavered. For someone trained to push forward no matter what, stopping felt impossible, but continuing felt unbearable. She withdrew. Days passed in isolation. Appetite disappeared. The world celebrated success she couldn't feel. And because Destiny's Child was still winning awards, she feared speaking honestly, worried that vulnerability would be dismissed, misunderstood, or weaponized. This is the paradox of early fame. The louder the applause, the quieter the pain is allowed to be. What pulled her back was not the industry. It was family. Specifically, her mother, who reminded her of something foundational. No achievement is worth losing yourself. That reminder didn't erase the damage, but it grounded her. As Destiny's Child regrouped with a revised lineup, the music returned, stronger, sharper, more defiant. Songs like Independent Women reframed the group's image, shifting the narrative from conflict to control. The message was clear: they were still standing. Commercially, the success was undeniable. Chart dominance returned. Awards followed. Destiny's Child reclaimed its position at the top of the industry. But the internal dynamic had changed forever. Beyoncé emerged from this period fundamentally altered, more guarded, more intentional, more aware of how narratives are constructed and how easily truth can be distorted. She learned that visibility without control is dangerous. That lesson would shape every move she made afterward. As the group approached a planned hiatus, the question loomed quietly but persistently: what comes next? For years, Beyoncé had functioned as part of a system, first family, then group. Even as the standout, her identity was intertwined with others. Now, for the first time, the possibility of standing alone wasn't theoretical. It was imminent. She had already tested the waters: collaborations, film roles, solo features. The response was immediate and telling. Audiences saw something different in her alone: authority without dilution, presence without negotiation. But stepping out meant risk. If she failed solo, the narrative would be unforgiving. If she succeeded, the backlash could be even harsher. Because when women outgrow expectations, they are rarely applauded quietly. As Destiny's Child announced their pause, the industry watched closely. Some expected Beyoncé to stumble. Others expected her to dominate. Very few understood what was actually happening. This was not ambition, breaking away from loyalty. This was survival, evolving into authorship. Beyoncé was not leaving a group. She was preparing to define herself, on her own terms, with no buffer, no shield, and no one else to absorb the impact. The girl who once learned discipline through repetition had now learned power through pain. And the next chapter of her story would not be shared. It would be claimed. There is a moment in every career when momentum is no longer enough. For Beyonce, that moment arrived when the safety net disappeared. Stepping away from Destiny's Child was not a celebration, it was a gamble. For years, the group had provided both power and protection. Shared success softened individual failure. Shared blame diffused scrutiny. Alone, there would be nowhere to hide. The industry noticed the shift immediately. Questions followed her into every room. Was she ready? Was the spotlight too heavy without a group to distribute it? Would audiences accept her not as part of a system, but as the system itself? She didn't answer with interviews. She answered with control. From the beginning, her solo vision was precise. She wasn't interested in easing audiences into a softer version of herself. She wanted impact, immediate, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. The music needed to sound confident without apology, sensual without compromise, and powerful without permission. That decision alone separated her from peers. While many artists softened their first solo steps, Beyoncé sharpened hers. The sound fused R&B, hip-hop, and pop with a level of assertiveness that felt intentional rather than reactive. The message was not "watch me try," it was "watch me lead." And the world watched. When the lead single arrived, it did not ask for approval. It commanded attention. The performance style was bolder. The visuals were more assertive. The identity was no longer shared, it was centered. This was not a reinvention. It was a revelation. Commercially, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Charts moved. Airwaves followed. Audiences responded not with curiosity, but with certainty. Beyoncé was no longer the standout member of a successful group. She was a dominant solo force. But success, especially rapid success, brings its own challenges. As accolades arrived, scrutiny intensified. Every performance was dissected. Every vocal run compared. Every stylistic choice debated. The industry began to test her, pushing, provoking, questioning whether the dominance could last. Beyoncé responded by expanding her role. She did not just perform songs, she shaped them. She did not just appear in visuals, she directed their narrative. She did not just release music, she constructed eras. The distinction mattered. This was authorship. Behind the scenes, she demanded more involvement than was customary for artists of her level, especially women. Song selection, vocal arrangement, choreography, staging, marketing. Nothing moved forward without her input. The result was cohesion, something audiences felt even if they couldn't articulate it. The performances became statements. She didn't rely on spectacle alone. Precision became her signature. Movement was intentional. Vocals were controlled rather than indulgent. Even moments of vulnerability felt measured, not because they were insincere, but because they were curated. This control was not about ego. It was about protection. Having learned how narratives could distort reality, Beyoncé ensured that the version of herself presented to the world was deliberate. Nothing accidental, nothing careless. That discipline created mystique, and mystique in pop culture is power. Her first solo era did more than succeed. It reset expectations. Suddenly, the industry had a new standard. A female solo artist could dominate charts without diluting authority. Sensuality could coexist with command. Vulnerability could exist alongside confidence. Beyoncé embodied contradiction and made it look effortless. But behind the polish, the pressure never eased. She was still carrying unresolved weight from the group years, still processing loss, scrutiny, and isolation. And now she carried it alone. There was no buffer, no collective identity to retreat into. That solitude forced reflection. Between tour, performances, and promotions, Beyoncé began to understand the cost of perpetual motion. Success kept her moving, but motion delayed reckoning. And reckoning, she would learn, cannot be avoided forever. As she continued to expand into film and collaborations, her profile grew broader. The public image became more complex. She was no longer just a musician, she was an entertainer in the fullest sense. Acting, touring, branding, each move widened her reach. But widening reach magnifies expectation. The industry wanted consistency, fans wanted access, media wanted narrative. Beyonce offered none of it freely. Instead, she doubled down on distance. Interviews became rarer. Appearances became strategic. Mystery deepened. This was not withdrawal. It was recalibration. By the end of her first solo chapter, Beyonce had achieved something rare, undeniable success without surrendering control. She proved that dominance did not require overexposure, that authority did not require explanation. She had crossed a threshold. No longer was the question whether she could stand alone. The question became how far she could go and what shape her power would take next. Because the solo gamble had paid off. And the next phase of her career would not be about proving herself to the industry. It would be about challenging it. Fame doesn't arrive as a finish line. It arrives as exposure. For Beyonce, the post-solo breakthrough years were not about proving talent anymore. That battle was over. What followed was more complex and more dangerous, sustaining dominance while the world watched every move with expectations sharpened into entitlement. The higher she climbed, the narrower the margin for error became. Success multiplied visibility. Visibility multiplied interpretation. Every lyric was read as confession, every performance as statement, every absence as strategy. The public didn't just consume her work, they tried to decode her life through it. And that pressure seeped inward. On stage, the performances grew bigger, louder, more spectacular. Tour expanded across continents. Choreography intensified. Vocals stretched across registers with surgical precision. Beyonce delivered consistency at a level that bordered on the mechanical night after night, city after city. But perfection has a cost. Behind the curtain, fatigue accumulated. Physical strain turned chronic. Emotional bandwidth narrowed. The schedule allowed little room for stillness, and stillness was the one thing she needed to hear herself think. This era demanded balance she hadn't yet learned. At the same time, her personal life entered public focus in a way it never had before. Relationships became headlines. Privacy dissolved. Speculation filled the gaps she refused to address. The world wanted access to the woman behind the performances, and she refused to give it freely. That refusal wasn't arrogance, it was instinct. Because by now, Beyonce understood something fundamental. Access is leverage. Once given, it cannot be reclaimed. And she had already learned how narratives can be built without consent. So she chose silence. Silence, however, does not stop conversation, it redirects it. Rumors intensified. Assumptions hardened. The louder the speculation grew, the quieter she became. This tension culminated in moments that tested her composure publicly. Award shows, media scrutiny, controversies not of her making. Each moment forced a decision: react emotionally or respond structurally. She chose structure. Rather than explaining herself, Beyonce began redesigning how she communicated. Instead of interviews, she used art. Instead of statements, she built experiences. Her music started carrying layered meanings, intimate but not explicit, revealing but not exposed. This shift marked a turning point. She was no longer just releasing albums. She was constructing narratives, controlled, deliberate, and immersive. Songs stopped standing alone. Visuals became essential. Themes extended beyond singles into full bodies of work. In other words, she stopped playing the game as it existed. She started redesigning it. This transition didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, strategic, and often misunderstood in real time. Critics questioned the distance. Fans debated the silence. Industry insiders speculated about motivation. But beneath the noise, something significant was forming. Beyonce was moving from performer to architect. An architect does not rush. An architect does not explain every decision. An architect builds systems that speak for themselves. and Beyonce was building one piece by piece. This era also forced her to confront vulnerability in ways she could no longer postpone. Personal loss, physical recovery, and emotional recalibration collided with professional obligation. The demand to always deliver collided with the reality of being human. For the first time in her adult career, she slowed, not visibly but internally. That internal pause reshaped her priorities. She began asserting clearer boundaries. Projects became fewer but heavier. Appearances became rarer but more intentional. The myth of constant accessibility was dismantled. This recalibration altered her relationship with power. She no longer needed to be everywhere to remain dominant. Presence, she learned, is magnified by restraint. Silence, when chosen, can be louder than constant noise. And audiences felt it. When she did appear, it mattered more. Performances carried weight. Releases felt deliberate. Even absence became part of the narrative. This strategic minimalism unsettled the industry. Pop culture thrives on predictability, rollouts, press cycles, overexposure. Beyoncé rejected that model. She withheld. She waited. She released on her terms, and when she did, the impact reverberated. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was evolution. As she refined her approach, she also expanded her influence beyond music. Fashion, visual art, business ventures, each move reinforced autonomy. Control was no longer just artistic, it was structural. Ownership became central. The lessons learned from early fame about contracts, management, perception were now informing decisions at the highest level. Beyoncé was no longer a participant in the industry's machinery. She was shaping it. By the end of this chapter, the transformation was undeniable. The artist who once had to fight for recognition had become a figure whose silence could shift markets and whose presence could redefine cultural moments. Yet even with that power, she remained cautious. Because power attracts resistance. The next phase of her journey would not just test her artistry, but her ability to carry cultural expectation without being consumed by it. The stakes were no longer personal alone. They were symbolic. And what came next would elevate her story beyond stardom, into legacy. There are moments in an artist's life when the work no longer follows trends. It creates gravity. For Beyoncé, that moment arrived not with noise, but with silence. No countdown. No press run. No warning. Just impact. When she reemerged, it was clear this was no longer about singles, charts, or conventional success. What Beyoncé unveiled marked a rupture in how music was released, consumed, and understood. The album was no longer just sound. It was sight, structure, and statement. This was the beginning of the visual era. Every song arrived with imagery. Every image carried symbolism. Each visual layer expanded meaning rather than explaining it. The work demanded attention, not passive listening. It required viewers to sit with discomfort, intimacy, sensuality, and contradiction, sometimes all at once. And the industry froze. Because no one had prepared for this. This release bypassed traditional systems entirely. No radio rollout, no label-driven hype. It trusted the audience to engage without instruction, and the audience did, instantly, completely. The ripple effects were immediate. Streaming platforms recalibrated. Marketing teams rewrote playbooks. Artists reconsidered the necessity of explanation. Suddenly, surprise was not reckless, it was powerful. But the deeper shift wasn't logistical. It was thematic. The music explored territories rarely granted space in mainstream pop. Marital tension, sexual agency, emotional vulnerability, female autonomy. These were not framed for approval. They were presented as lived realities, messy, complex, unapologetic. This was not a plea to be understood. It was a declaration of presence. Critics scrambled to catch up. Some praised the audacity. Others questioned the distance, the refusal to contextualize. But debate itself became proof of success. The work refused to be ignored, reduced, or simplified. It forced engagement. More importantly, it redefined authorship. Beyoncé was no longer just the voice. She was the curator, the director, the editor. Control over narrative extended from lyrics to visuals to distribution. This level of ownership had been rare, especially for women in pop at this scale. And it changed expectations permanently. From this point forward, albums were no longer enough. Fans began demanding worlds, cohesion, intent. Visual storytelling became part of the artistic baseline, not an accessory. But while the world focused on innovation, something else was happening beneath the surface. Beyoncé was reclaiming authorship over her story. For years, her life had been speculated upon, dissected, narrated by others. This era flipped that dynamic. She didn't deny rumors, she reframed them. She embedded truth within art, choosing metaphor over confession, control over chaos. This approach did something radical. It restored mystery. In a culture obsessed with oversharing, Beyoncé proved that withholding could be more revealing than disclosure. That you could speak volumes without saying everything. That privacy, when chosen, could coexist with vulnerability. This balance elevated her from celebrity to cultural figure. Because culture is not built on access alone. It's built on symbols, moments, and shared interpretation. Beyoncé was no longer reacting to discourse, she was generating it. The performances that followed reinforced this shift. They were no longer just concerts. They were choreographed statements. Costumes referenced history. Movements echoed lineage. Stages transformed into spaces of remembrance, resistance, and celebration. Every detail felt intentional. Nothing was decorative. Audiences didn't just attend shows. They witnessed narratives unfold. Each performance became a living extension of the work, evolving from city to city, absorbing local energy while maintaining a unified vision. This era also marked a sharpening of political and cultural consciousness. Without speeches or slogans, the work addressed identity, race, gender, and power. It honored ancestry. It challenged erasure. It asserted presence where absence had long been normalized. And it did so without asking permission. The response was polarizing by design. Some celebrated the boldness, others resisted the discomfort. But resistance only underscored the work's necessity. Art that leaves everyone comfortable rarely changes anything. Beyoncé understood this. She was no longer interested in consensus. She was interested in truth, her truth, filtered through art rather than apology. This chapter also solidified her influence beyond music. Fashion responded. Academia responded. Cultural commentary followed. The work entered classrooms, essays, debates. It lived beyond playlists. It became reference material. And perhaps most importantly, it expanded what was possible for artists who came after, especially women of color. It demonstrated that autonomy was not just aspirational, it was achievable. That control over narrative was not arrogance, it was survival. That success did not require dilution. By the end of this era, Beyoncé had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer measured against peers. She was measured against impact. What came next would push even further, transforming performance into ritual, presence into symbolism, and success into legacy. Because when an artist reaches this level, the question is no longer what will they do next. It becomes, what does the world do after them? There comes a point when fame stops being personal. For Beyoncé, that point arrived when her presence no longer simply moved audiences, it shifted systems. This was the era where scale changed meaning. Concerts became global events, not because of size alone, but because of symbolism. Stadiums were no longer venues, they were gathering places. Each performance functioned like a ritual choreographed not just for entertainment, but for resonance. What unfolded on stage echoed far beyond the final note. This was not touring. This was transmission. Across continents, languages, and cultures, the work traveled intact, its themes legible without translation. Identity, pride, history, joy, grief, power. The message didn't dilute as it expanded. If anything, it sharpened. That is the hallmark of cultural leadership. Beyoncé's global reach was not accidental. It was built with intention, rooted in respect for lineage and place. Performances referenced ancestral memory while remaining undeniably contemporary. Visuals pulled from tradition without reducing it to costume. Sound fused genres without erasing their origins. This approach reframed globalization itself. Instead of exporting a single narrative outward, Beyoncé absorbed influences inward, allowing collaboration to feel reciprocal rather than extractive. Artists, dancers, designers from around the world were not accessories. They were contributors, partners, co-authors. That distinction mattered. Because at this level, representation without agency is hollow. Beyoncé understood that visibility alone is insufficient. It must be paired with voice and ownership. This philosophy extended beyond performance. Her business structures evolved alongside her art. Control over masters, ownership of production, direct relationships with platforms. Each move reduced dependency on legacy systems that had historically limited creative autonomy. This was not rebellion. It was blueprinting. An institution is defined not by longevity alone, but by infrastructure. Beyoncé was building one quietly, deliberately, where artistry and agency coexisted. As her influence expanded, so did scrutiny. Cultural leadership invites resistance. Every statement, spoken or silent, was weighed. Every absence interpreted. Every presence politicized. But she no longer responded to reaction. She responded to responsibility. Instead of commentary, she delivered action. Investments in community, amplification of marginalized voices, support structures embedded into tour, releases, and partnerships. Impact became operational, not performative. This recalibrated expectations. Audiences no longer looked to her just for music. They looked for direction, for alignment, for meaning in moments of fracture. That is a heavy burden, and one she did not ask for but accepted with discipline. Importantly, she never framed herself as a savior. Leadership in her model was not about dominance. It was about stewardship, using scale to protect space for others, using influence to open doors rather than stand in front of them. This distinction preserved credibility. As a result, her cultural authority deepened. Academics analyzed her work. Institutions invited her participation. Governments acknowledged her presence. Yet she remained selective, appearing where alignment existed, withdrawing where it did not. Power, when exercised sparingly, multiplies. This chapter also marked a refinement of legacy thinking. Beyoncé began working not just for immediate impact, but for historical placement. Projects were designed to age well, to retain relevance beyond release cycles. That meant resisting trends, avoiding overexposure, choosing depth over frequency. The result was longevity without stagnation. She did not chase relevance. Relevance chased her. On the global stage, this manifested as something rare. An artist whose influence did not diminish with distance. Whether in North America, Europe, Africa, or beyond, the response was not novelty, it was recognition. People did not attend to see a celebrity. They came to witness a moment. And moments, when shared collectively, become memory. By this phase of her journey, Beyoncé had achieved what few artists ever do. She became a reference point, not just for success, but for possibility. A living example of what happens when talent is paired with vision, discipline, and ownership. Still, she remained unfinished. Because leadership is not static, it demands renewal. The next phase would require confronting time itself, aging in an industry obsessed with youth, evolution in a culture addicted to nostalgia. The question ahead was no longer about ascent. It was about endurance, and how to remain vital without repeating oneself. Time is the one opponent no artist can defeat, only negotiate with. For Beyoncé, This negotiation became the defining challenge of her later career. Not because relevance was slipping, but because the industry has never known how to coexist with women who age without apology. Pop culture rewards youth, then punishes survival. By this stage, Beyoncé had nothing left to prove. Records, accolades, and global recognition were already secured, yet expectation did not loosen, it intensified. The world demanded reinvention, but on its terms. Evolution, but without discomfort. Familiarity, but never repetition. This contradiction has ended many careers. Beyoncé refused it. Rather than chasing reinvention for novelty's sake, she reframed the concept entirely. Reinvention, in her language, did not mean becoming someone new. It meant uncovering layers that had always existed, but were previously hidden by momentum. This shift required restraint. She slowed releases, reduced visibility, allowed space between projects large enough for anticipation to build naturally. In an era of constant output, absence became her sharpest tool. And absence worked. When she returned, it wasn't as a reminder of past dominance, it was as proof of ongoing relevance. The work did not feel nostalgic. It felt current, but unbothered by trend cycles, rooted, but not static. This balance is rare. Most artists either chase youth or retreat into legacy. Beyoncé chose a third path, presence without desperation. Her work acknowledged time without being defined by it. Musically, this meant freedom. Genres blurred further, boundaries softened. The music referenced history without replicating it, innovation without alienation. She explored joy, grief, sensuality, spirituality, not as phases, but as coexisting states. Emotion matured. The urgency of early ambition was replaced by clarity. Lyrics became less explanatory, more declarative. She no longer argued her worth, she inhabited it. Visually, the evolution was just as deliberate. Performances did not attempt to outdo past spectacle. They refined it. Precision replaced excess. Symbolism replaced shock. The body on stage was no longer just athletic, it was expressive of experience. This mattered, because women in pop are rarely allowed to age visibly without being reframed as either diminished or nostalgic. Beyoncé rejected both categories. She did not lean into comeback narratives. She did not apologize for maturity. She normalized it. This normalization quietly shifted industry standards. Younger artists saw a future that didn't end at a certain age. Older audiences saw themselves reflected without irony. The myth that relevance has an expiration date began to crack. But this era was not without tension. As time passed, expectations grew heavier. Each release was treated not just as music, but as cultural referendum. Silence was interpreted. Choices were politicized. Even restraint became a subject of debate. Beyoncé did not engage. She had learned that longevity requires detachment, not indifference, but clarity about what deserves response. Not every conversation is worth entering. Not every critique deserves oxygen. This discernment protected the work. It also protected her. Behind the scenes, priorities shifted further. Family, health, sustainability, these were no longer secondary to career. They were integrated into it. Touring schedules adapted. Creative timelines expanded. Perfection was redefined. Not as flawlessness, but as alignment. This alignment extended to leadership. Beyoncé no longer positioned herself at the center of every moment. Collaborations increased, but hierarchy flattened. Others were elevated without diminishing her presence. This is a sign of confidence. Because insecurity hoards attention, confidence redistributes it. By this chapter, Beyoncé was no longer just navigating time. She was teaching others how to do it. How to evolve without erasing oneself. How to mature without becoming invisible. How to remain powerful without being loud. And perhaps most importantly, how to leave space behind. Space for reinterpretation, for future artists, for the work to breathe on its own terms. This is the paradox of longevity. The longer you stay, the less you must cling. Beyonce understood that. As she entered this phase, the narrative around her subtly changed. She was no longer framed as the benchmark to surpass, but as the standard to understand. A reference point rather than a rival. This does not diminish relevance. It cements it. Because trends expire, standards endure. And Beyonce had become one. Yet even now, the story was not closing. The final chapters were not about retirement or retreat. They were about legacy in motion, what it means to exist fully in the present while shaping how the future remembers you. That reckoning comes next. Legacy is often discussed as something that happens after the work is finished. For Beyonce, legacy was never a closing chapter. It was an operating principle, something built deliberately while the spotlight was still warm, while relevance was still unquestioned, while power was still active. This distinction matters. Most icons are canonized after decline or departure. Their influence is measured in hindsight. Beyonce refused that framework. She chose to shape how she would be remembered while she was still creating, still deciding, still evolving. That choice altered the trajectory of everything that followed. Rather than announcing final acts or signaling conclusions, she focused on foundations, structures that would outlast individual releases, systems that could sustain meaning without constant presence. This was not about exit. It was about continuity. Her projects in this era carried a different weight. They felt archival even when new, designed to live beyond the moment of release. Music, visuals, performances, and partnerships were treated as documents of culture rather than disposable content. Each work functioned as both expression and record. This approach reframed success. Numbers mattered less than permanence. Virality was secondary to resonance. The question shifted from "how big is this?" to "how long will this last?" And longevity became the metric. Beyonce also began to lean more visibly into lineage, both honoring those who came before her and investing in those who would come after. Influence was no longer just something she embodied. It was something she redistributed. Emerging artists were platformed without being positioned as proteges. They were collaborators, peers in the making, voices worth amplifying on their own terms. This distinction preserved dignity and agency. Because inheritance without autonomy is just repetition. She understood that true legacy is not about replication. It's about expansion. Creating space for others to grow beyond you rather than beneath you. This philosophy extended into how she used visibility. Appearances became symbolic. When she showed up, it was rarely accidental. Each moment carried intention, whether celebrating cultural milestones, honoring collective memory, or reinforcing narratives of resilience and joy. Joy, notably, became more central. Not as escapism, but as resistance. In a world defined by exhaustion, conflict, and constant crisis, joy itself became political. Beyonce's work began embracing pleasure, movement, celebration, not as distraction, but as affirmation of life and survival. This reframing was subtle, but powerful. It reminded audiences that legacy is not only forged through struggle. It is also sustained through happiness, connection, and the courage to exist fully without justification. At the same time, she continued to guard mystery. Even as her influence expanded, she resisted over-explanation. No memoir, no exhaustive tell-all, no definitive narrative closure. She allowed gaps to remain, inviting interpretation rather than dictating meaning. This restraint preserved myth. Because legacy thrives on openness. It requires room for reinterpretation across generations. By refusing to seal her story prematurely, Beyonce ensured it would remain alive, flexible enough to be revisited, reframed, and rediscovered. This is a rare discipline. The temptation to summarize oneself is strong, especially after decades of scrutiny. But summarization freezes identity. Beyonce chose motion instead. She also redefined what it means to step back. Rather than disappearing, she shifted roles. From center stage to overseer, from constant presence to strategic guidance, her influence became less visible, but more embedded. This kind of power is difficult to measure. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time, in changed norms, expanded possibilities, and new standards that feel inevitable in hindsight. By this chapter, Beyonce had accomplished something few cultural figures manage. She decoupled relevance from frequency. She no longer needed constant output to remain central. Her absence did not weaken her position, it reinforced it. Because anticipation became part of the experience, audiences didn't move on during the quiet. They waited. Waiting, in a culture of immediacy, is a sign of trust. Trust that when she returns, it will matter. This trust is perhaps her greatest legacy in progress. It speaks to credibility earned over time, consistency without stagnation, evolution without erasure. As she continued forward, there was no declared endpoint, no final album announced, no farewell tour promised, no attempt to control how the story would end. And that, paradoxically, made the legacy stronger. Because the most enduring figures do not tell us when to stop listening. They simply continue to exist, creating, influencing, shaping, until their presence becomes inseparable from the culture itself. Beyonce had reached that threshold. The work was no longer chasing history. It was becoming part of it. Every icon begins as a story. But not every story survives success. For Beyonce, the shift from artist to myth did not happen because the story was perfected. It happened because the story became too large to contain within traditional narrative boundaries. At a certain level of cultural saturation, biography stops being sufficient. Facts blur into interpretation. Timelines collapse. Individual moments become symbolic. The person becomes reference rather than subject. This is where Beyonce arrived. Her career no longer functioned as a sequence of albums or eras. It operated as a body of meaning, invoked rather than explained. People referenced her not just for what she did, but for what she represented. Excellence without compromise, control without cruelty, visibility without surrender. This symbolic role was not self-appointed. It was conferred. Audiences, critics, institutions, all began speaking about her in the language reserved for constants rather than contemporaries. Comparisons shifted from peers to predecessors, from rivals to archetypes. She was no longer one of the best. She was a category. This transition brought a new kind of pressure. Myth invites projection. People attach values, expectations, and ideals that may never have belonged to the individual in the first place. The icon becomes a mirror for collective desire and frustration. Beyonce understood this risk. Rather than resisting myth, she narrowed her presence within it. She spoke less, appeared selectively, allowed the work to carry meaning without constant clarification. This restraint prevented over-identification. Because when an icon explains too much, the myth collapses into personality. Beyonce protected the boundary between who she is and what she signifies. That boundary preserved power. As a result, her image stopped aging in conventional terms. She did not become a figure of nostalgia or memorialization. She remained current without chasing novelty, relevant without dilution. This is the defining trait of a cultural constant. A constant does not compete with the present, it anchors it. Beyonce's influence became visible in subtle ways, not just in artists citing her as inspiration, but in how the industry began to resemble her standards. Visual cohesion became expected. Narrative albums became common. Surprise releases became strategic tools. What once seemed radical became normalized. This normalization is the clearest evidence of impact. But normalization also carries irony. When influence becomes invisible, credit is often forgotten. New generations encounter the effects without knowing the origin. Beyonce appeared unbothered by this. Legacy, at this stage, was not about recognition. It was about permanence. She had moved beyond the need to be named in every conversation. Her presence was embedded, like architecture you stop noticing until it's gone. This embeddedness extended into culture beyond music. Fashion cycles echoed her silhouettes. Language borrowed her phrases. Performance standards mirrored her discipline. Even silence became performative in her shadow. When Beyonce did choose to speak, through work, not commentary, it landed with disproportionate weight. Not because of hype, but because of rarity. Each moment felt deliberate, anchored in context rather than reaction. This discipline kept the myth intact. Importantly, she never allowed herself to become untouchable. Distance existed, but not detachment. The work still engaged emotion, still invited connection, still reflected lived experience, just without oversharing. This balance preserved humanity within myth. Because myth without humanity becomes statue. Beyonce avoided that fate by grounding her symbolism in feeling. Joy, grief, pride, vulnerability, rendered through art rather than confession. As time progressed, her role in culture resembled stewardship more than stardom. She didn't dominate conversations. She shaped conditions under which conversations evolved. This is how icons outgrow narrative. They stop being subjects of debate and become frameworks for understanding. People no longer ask, "What is she doing?" They ask, "What does this moment mean in relation to her?" That shift is irreversible. And it is rare. Most careers peak and decline within cycles of novelty. Beyoncé's trajectory bent away from that arc. It flattened into continuity, presence without saturation, influence without exhaustion. At this point, endings became irrelevant. Whether she released new music frequently or not, the cultural imprint was secure. The myth did not depend on constant reinforcement. It had already been absorbed into collective memory. Yet she remained alive within it, creating when she chose, appearing when alignment existed, withholding when silence served the work. This agency ensured the myth remained flexible rather than fixed. The final transformation was subtle but profound. Beyoncé was no longer merely remembered in moments. She was referenced in structures, in how artists planned careers, in how audiences evaluated excellence, in how institutions recognized cultural contribution. That is the highest tier of influence. Not dominance, not ubiquity, but inevitability. And with that inevitability came a quiet truth. The story no longer needed continuation to remain complete. It could pause indefinitely and still feel whole. The next chapter does not close the narrative. It reframes it. Because the final question is no longer what will she do next. It is, how does culture move after someone like her has already changed the shape of what's possible? Greatness is often misunderstood. It is confused with dominance, numbers, spectacle, or visibility. But true greatness operates differently. It does not shout for recognition. It settles into place, reshaping the landscape so thoroughly that its influence becomes inseparable from the ground itself. This is where Beyoncé now exists. Beyond eras, beyond genres, beyond conclusions. At this stage, the traditional markers of a career no longer apply. There is no clear beginning or ending, only continuation, pause, and reemergence. Her work does not demand constant engagement to remain relevant. It lingers, referenced instinctively, invoked without explanation. That is permanence. Beyoncé's journey did not culminate in a final statement or a definitive peak. Instead, it flattened into consistency, an enduring presence that resists decline. She did not burn brightly and fade. She learned how to hold light. And that skill is rare. Most artists are defined by eras because eras end. Beyoncé transcended that framework by refusing to be contained within one. Each phase of her career did not replace the last, it absorbed it. The past remained visible without overshadowing the present. This accumulation is what transformed her from icon to constant. Cultural constants do not require defense. They do not rely on nostalgia. They do not need to be reintroduced to each generation. They simply exist, ready to be discovered and rediscovered, each time offering something new without abandoning what came before. This is why her work continues to resonate across age, geography, and identity. Younger audiences encounter her not as history, but as relevance. Older audiences do not experience her as memory, but as continuity. The work bridges time rather than belonging to it. That bridging is intentional. Beyonce never positioned herself as timeless through detachment. She remained deeply engaged with the present, its tensions, its movements, its contradictions. But she refused to chase immediacy. Instead, she filtered the present through craft, patience, and purpose. This discipline allowed her work to age forward rather than expire. Importantly, she did not achieve permanence by becoming neutral. On the contrary, she embraced specificity of culture, identity, emotion. The paradox is that the more specific her work became, the more universal it felt. Because truth, when expressed clearly, travels. Her greatness lies not just in what she created, but in how she created it. The refusal to rush, the insistence on ownership, the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it prematurely, the commitment to joy without apology. These choices reshape the definition of success. Success, in her model, is not measured by ubiquity. It is measured by impact that outlasts attention, by influence that remains legible even when the creator steps back. This reframing altered how future artists imagined their own trajectories. It expanded the horizon of what was possible, especially for women, especially for those historically expected to peak early and fade quietly. Beyoncé rejected that narrative completely. She demonstrated that longevity does not require compromise, that maturity can sharpen edge rather than dull it, that control and vulnerability are not opposites, but partners. And perhaps most crucially, she showed that greatness does not require constant explanation. Throughout her journey, she resisted the urge to summarize herself. No definitive manifesto, no exhaustive self-interpretation. She trusted the work to speak in layers, allowing audiences to meet it where they were. This trust preserved depth, because when an artist explains everything, there is nothing left to discover. By leaving space, Beyoncé ensured that her work would continue to invite engagement long after the moment of release. Each return reveals something previously unnoticed. Each generation finds a different entry point. That is how permanence sustains itself. As the cultural conversation moves forward, new voices rising, new forms emerging, Beyoncé's presence remains felt not as competition, but as foundation. A reference point for excellence. A reminder of what intention can accomplish when paired with discipline. She does not need to dominate the future to remain part of it. She already is. In the end, the measure of her greatness is not how loudly she is remembered, but how naturally she is included. In discussions of art, power, identity, performance, legacy, her name does not interrupt the conversation. It completes it. And so this story does not close with a farewell. Because permanence does not say goodbye. It stays, quietly shaping what comes next. Every great story reaches a point where it must stop explaining and simply exist. This is that point. Because after everything you've seen, heard, and felt, one truth remains clear. Beyoncé is not a moment in time. She is a measure of it. From talent to discipline, from ambition to authorship, from visibility to permanence, her journey was never about chasing applause. It was about building something that could stand when the noise faded. Something that could hold meaning even when she stepped away from the center of the frame. And that is why this documentary does not end with a conclusion. It ends with understanding. Because Beyoncé's story is not one of arrival, it is one of intention. Every phase, every pivot, every pause was deliberate, not rushed, not reactive, chosen. She did not simply survive an industry designed to consume and discard. She redesigned the terms of engagement. She showed that longevity is not luck, it is structure. That control is not ego, it is protection. That silence can be as powerful as sound when it is intentional. And now, the lens turns outward. Because this story was never meant to live on a screen alone. It lives in the people who watched it and recognized themselves in the discipline, the resilience, the refusal to shrink. It lives in anyone who has been told their time has passed, their voice is too much, their ambition is inconvenient, or their identity is negotiable. This is your moment to sit with what this journey represents. Not fame, not perfection, not celebrity, but agency. The ability to define your own pace in a world that demands urgency. The courage to evolve without erasing where you came from. The strength to withhold when everything around you pushes for exposure. Beyonce did not teach the world how to be famous. She taught it how to be deliberate. So here is the call to action, not as instruction, but as invitation. Reflect on the way you move through your own story. Where are you rushing because you were told you should? Where are you shrinking because visibility feels unsafe? Where are you explaining yourself when your work could speak instead? This documentary is not asking you to become Beyonce. It is asking you to become author of your own narrative. To decide what deserves your energy. To decide when to speak and when silence is strategic. To decide how you want to be remembered, even while you are still becoming. Because legacy is not something you leave behind. It is something you practice daily. And if this story resonated with you, if it challenged your assumptions about success, power, or longevity, do not let it end here. Share it with someone who believes their moment has passed. Talk about it with someone who thinks reinvention requires abandonment. Carry the conversation forward into spaces where ambition is still treated as arrogance, especially when it comes from women. Because stories like this matter most when they are retold, not as worship, but as reference. Reference for what is possible when talent meets patience, when vision meets ownership, when excellence is sustained rather than consumed. Beyonce's journey reminds us that the most powerful people are not always the loudest in the room. They are the ones who decide when to enter, when to exit, and when to let the work remain. So as the screen fades and the music settles, remember this. You do not owe the world constant access to your becoming. You do not need permission to evolve. And you do not have to announce your next chapter for it to be valid. Some of the most important work happens quietly, before the applause, after the spotlight, away from the commentary. This documentary does not mark the end of a career. It marks the understanding of one. And understanding, once gained, does not disappear. It reshapes how we see success, how we see time, how we see ourselves. So take that with you. Because if this story has shown us anything, it's that greatness is not about being everywhere. It's about being intentional, wherever you are. And